in terms of records, I spent quite a lot of time at the National Library in Pretoria, going through newspaper archives of old. I spent time at Wits Library in Johannesburg, Wits University Library, and there I got records, including old letters that Mangope had written to some people, and some people writing back to him, and also records of his stay at St. Peter's Secondary School. I was also able to spend some time at the National Archives Center in Pretoria. His legacy is as divisive as ever. At any given time, if you participate in a public discussion about him, you are likely to find passionate arguments about how good of a political player he was, how much of a visionary he was. His legacy is as divisive as ever. At any given time, if you participate in a public discussion about him, you are likely to find passionate arguments about how good of a political player he was, how much of a visionary he was.
The Groundbreakers, Mondays to Thursdays, 7 to 9 p.m. on TUT FM.
Once again, good evening and welcome to Plug a Graduate. We do apologize for that. I wouldn't say little convenience, but we had some technical problems that we were dealing with. But to delve into the conversation of today, I was saying today we are joined by a special guest who's the head of communications and stakeholder relations at the South African Weather Services, who is also the author of the book Lucas Mangope, Alive. Another book delves into the life of a figure that played a pivotal role in South Africa's history, particularly during the apartheid era. Mangope, often a controversial figure, was a leader of the Setswana homeland. Now, tonight we are here to explore not only his life, but the journey of writing and publishing such a significant biography. Mr. Oupa, good evening and welcome to Plug a Graduate.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I'd like to once again apologize for those little issues that we were experiencing that I was telling you all about off air. But before we delve into the details of the book, right, I would like to understand your personal connection to the subject. What motivated you to write this biography? Was there something specific about his life or legacy that resonated with you, whether personally or professionally?
Well, first and foremost, Mangope, who is late now, he passed away in 2018, was from a rural village outside the small town of Zeerust called Motswedi. He was born there, he was raised there, and he grew up to be a traditional leader there, and he passed away there and was buried there as well. And that's the same rural village from which I come. I was born there myself, and growing up there, he was not just, our president under Setswana. He was also our traditional leader. So I suppose that would be the first connection. But what motivated the writing of this book for me was my childhood memories. I was around about 10 years of age in 1994 when the Setswana government collapsed. And I recall there was just a lot of talk about his role in the whole fiasco. That is the role of Mangope. And those kind of discussions were taking place pretty much everywhere in the village, at school, at the shops, even in my own household, where he was held in the highest regard. I used to hear elders at home talking about how he had brought about development in Setswana. He had, spearheaded the kind of administration that saw the economy of that particular homeland, growing, such that there were jobs and so forth. And so they spoke in those terms about him, that he was a good man, and that those who were approaching on the horizon to bring about the democracy that we have now were said to be the bad guys who were coming to take away all of the good things that we had under Setswana. That was the sentiment at home. But the moment I engaged with other people in the streets, or at least eavesdropped on the conversations that took place elsewhere in the village, be it at school or at the shops, in the streets. People had a different opinion about him. They said he was one of those people who wanted the status quo being the apartheid regime, to remain intact. They said that his government was corrupt, his government was brutal, he was heavy-handed in terms of dealing with those who disagreed with him politically. So I grew up with that kind of contradiction, such that in later life, I noticed that in the telling of our the telling of the story of our transition from apartheid to democracy,
Yeah.
there was little said about him, and that caused me to consider, telling his story as I have since done. So that was the inspiration behind the book. Besides, I consume a lot of domestic political literature, and I noticed that we tend to read a lot more about the role of those who were at the forefront of the struggle for liberation, to the exclusion of others. And I hold the view that literature should be as broad as possible. We shouldn't just write about people that we consider heroes. We should write about everyone's role, so that those who will come from us and read these books get a clearer picture of what was going on in our times, and get to understand their ancestral heritage, insofar as politics is concerned, and so forth.
Yes. Now, that's a very, I would say, very mouthful answer, and I thank you for that. And I have a couple of questions that delves within, the research that went through into writing that book, and we'll definitely get to those, because some of those focus too much in terms of him, the life that he had felt. So it's terms of biographical questions, but to get some of these questions that I'd prepared for you out of the way so that we deal with that, I would understand that Mangope's leadership of Botswana remains a complex chapter within South Africa's history. Right. And it is not widely covered in mainstream education, and many may not fully grasp its importance in the broader context of South African history. So the question comes to says, for those unfamiliar, can you just give us an overview of who Lucas Mangope was and the role he played in South Africa's political landscape, and why do you think his story is such important to tell?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I've already mentioned that he was a traditional leader,
Yes, true.
in my home village of Motswedi, where you find a community called Bahurutsi Bomanyani. But before he rose to the position of chief, he was a high school teacher in that very same village. We have a boarding school there, which used to be, the place to study back in the apartheid days, because you had people from as far afield as Rustenburg, some even from Johannesburg, as boarding students there, taking their high school lessons. So he used to be a teacher there, and then he quit teaching at the point of taking over from his father, who had been a chief of the Bahurus Bomanyani before him. But later on, he entered mainstream politics. You may remember around 1959 or 60, the political system in the country changed with the introduction of the Bantu Authorities Act, which established, what we would later know as homelands or Bantustans.
Yes, true.
So he traversed that area of his career as a budding politician, and such that in the late 70s, we saw him leading the homeland of Bophuthatswana to independence, until Bophuthatswana collapsed in 1994. And post 1994, he rebranded the political party that ran the government of Bophuthatswana, which was called Bophuthatswana Democratic Party. But in the early 90s, it changed its name to Christian Democratic Party. And post 1994, it was known as the United Christian Democratic Party. It contested the elections for the very first time in post-apartheid South Africa in 1999. I'm referring here to the national and provincial elections.
Elections, yes.
And following that participation in the elections, it could only rise to the position of official opposition in the Northwest Province. And it's the role that the party played for two successive terms until 1990, until 2009, at which point things started going downhill for him. So, in a nutshell, I could say he was a traditional leader, he was a teacher, and he was a politician, both under apartheid and post-apartheid. In apartheid, he was the political head of the homeland of Setswana. In post-apartheid, he was an official leader of the official opposition in the Northwest Provincial Legislature.
Yes, true. Very, very nice. I didn't know that he was a teacher, though. I tried to read up with about him, but I couldn't find the time. But I'm definitely looking forward to looking at reading that book. And I know writing a biography, especially about a political figure, must come with its own set of challenges, right? From accessing reliable information to sifting through various perspectives. So, what was the research process for this book about, right? Did you encounter any difficulties in obtaining primary sources or interviewing key individuals who knew him, given much of his legacy, given that much of his legacy is intertwined with controversial homeland systems?
Yeah, I suppose the research was just as challenging as it would be for any other person undertaking this kind of work. In my case, first and foremost, I must indicate that I never got the opportunity to sit down with him and interview him, because as the subject, he would have made a very important source of information, because the story is about him. But I suppose I started working on this project quite late, because at the time of my making contact with him for the purposes of a sit down, his mind was already failing him. His memory was gone.
Yes.
I later learned that he had a touch of dementia, such that when you engaged with him, he would not make sense at times. And that caused me then to go with secondary sources.
Yeah.
And that would be people and documents and records and so forth. So the people that I spoke to first and foremost were his family. I spoke to a number of his children. I spoke to his widowed wife. I spoke to his only surviving sibling. He was the first of about 7 children, and then the youngest one is still alive. I was able to sit down with her to go down memory lane, especially about where they grew up, how they grew up, how they were raised, and that kind of thing. And I also got the chance to speak to a number of former Bophuthatswana government ministers who worked under him. I was able to speak to people that you would consider his political allies from back in the day. People like Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, may his soul rest in peace. I was able to get a lot of information from him about their interactions in the run-up to independence of Bophuthatswana, what they used to discuss, where they stood insofar as the whole question of independence was concerned. I was also able to speak to the former president, F.W. de Klerk, about his recollection of their interactions going back into time. But I was also able to speak to people that you would call his political nemesis, like Dr. Popo Molefe, who was the premier of the Northwest Province after 1994. They had interactions prior to independence, I mean, prior to democracy, because they were trying to persuade him to join the rest of the people on the march to the new South Africa. I spoke to people like Mr. Andrew Mlangeni, who is also late. May his soul rest in peace. He and Hosi Mangope went to the same secondary school called St. Peter's in Rosettenville, south of Johannesburg, in the 40s. I was also able to speak to a whole range of other people like Supra Mahuma Pelo, who was the Northwest Premier At some point, I spoke to the likes of Mr. Matthews Posa, who was the Treasurer General of the ANC at the time and formed part of the delegation that was sent to Mahikeng, led by President Nelson Mandela, to go and negotiate with Kgosi Mangope on the eve of democracy. So I spoke to quite a long
A number
list
of people. Yeah.
But in terms of records, I spent quite a lot of time at the National Library in Pretoria, going through newspaper archives of old. I spent time at Wits Library in Johannesburg, Wits University Library, and there I got records, including old letters that Kgosi Mangope had written to some people, and some people writing back to him, and also records of his stay at St. Peter's Secondary School. I was also able to spend some time at the National Archives Center in Pretoria, where I got hold of a lot of material. And while I was traveling overseas as well, I got some material at the Center for Black History. It's a wing of the New York Public Library in Harlem. There was quite a lot of material about South Africa, and interestingly enough, it's the kind of material that you don't even find here at home. I was just surprised that people out there have a lot of information about us, and yet we have not done well to preserve that kind of information. I also accessed some material at the Cape Town wing of the National Library. So there was quite a lot of information that one had to unearth in order to be in a position to properly tell the story of Kgosi Mangope.
And while we're still there, a lot might understand that biographies by nature often reveal both the strengths and flaws of their subjects, right? Lungas Mangope's political actions were seen by a lot of people, or some, as a form of collaboration with the apartheid regime, while others may argue that he was trying to preserve some form of autonomy for his people. Now, the question with that statement being said, it says, how did you approach writing about such a decisive figure? Did you feel pressure to remain objective, or did your own interpretations inevitably shape parts of the book?
I allowed the research to influence the direction of the story. And I found it very important to take that route, because you don't want to approach a story like this with preconceived ideas. You need to bring an independent mind to the project and let the research influence the direction of the story, as I said. And as a trained journalist who graduated from TUT, I must say, I had to employ journalistic principles of truth, accuracy, and fairness.
Yes.
So, and I was alive to the reality that Kgosi Mangope is a polarizing figure. His legacy is as divisive as ever. At any given time, if you participate in a public discussion about him, you are likely to find passionate arguments about how good of a political player he was, how much of a visionary he was, how much no one compares to him in the realm of politics. But equally, the other extreme would say, no, he was none of those things. He was as bad as they come. He was corrupt. He was this and that. So when you approach a story like this, you need to be balanced and ensure that all of those views shine through the story. You don't mute any view. You take the good and the bad, and you make do with all of that to ensure that your story is fair to him, but it's also fair to the truth and to honesty. It should be told in the most frank and honest way, and you should go about doing it without fear, favor, or prejudice. Because when you research this kind of story, go into his family, for instance, you need to win their trust. They need to trust that you have pure intentions. You have no ace up your sleeve. And that takes time. And during the course of developing that relationship, they get to a point where they trust you wholeheartedly. But you need to take good care to avoid being a prisoner of that good relationship. In other words, despite those good relations, you must still be able to go back to your laptop and type a story, approaching it without fear, favor, or prejudice. This is to say, you mustn't fear that the relations will sour because you have said something in the
Some
book
certain things, yeah.
that is true, but might not sit well with them. You mustn't do them any favors by sweeping certain things under the carpet because you fear that they will be embarrassed if those things were to come out. But at the same time, you mustn't go out of your way to be prejudicial to them and to him in particular. So you need to strike a very good balance of all of those things. Otherwise, you run the risk of having a book that will be dismissed as a whitewash.
And then you hinted something about legacy there, and then I thought I should ask you this question. In your view, what is Mangope's legacy today? Do you think his contributions and decisions are perceived by the people of the Northwest? How are they perceived by the people of the Northwest and South Africa as a whole?
Well, the legacy, as I said, is divisive. His legacy is divisive. You find people who hold him in high regard, saying that, no politician come close to him in terms of his kind of politics, in terms of what he stood for, in terms of what, in their view, he did for the people of Bophuthatswana and so forth. And these people will often point to the infrastructure expansion that we saw developing in Bophuthatswana from the 70s all the way up to the late 80s as some of the indicators of the good politician that they believe he was. I mean, you go to Mabatu today, you will find the building that the SABC operates from. It was built during the Bophuthatswana days, and just across the road from the SABC, you go to the University of the Northwest Mahikeng campus. That's the institution that was built during Kgosi Mangope's time. And then just a few meters away from there, you find the Haruna building, which houses the office of the premier and a few other government departments in that province. Those were built during Bophuthatswana. I can go on and on. The Mabana Arts and Culture Center, where a lot of our showbiz personalities were groomed, was built during that time, and everywhere else in that part of the country. I mean, you go to places like Hammanskraal, there were factories there, and then the same can be said about Mohwase near Sun City. Sun City itself comes from that era. And so people point at those things, including your Odi Stadium, Mabatu Stadium, as some of the indicators of Kgosi Mangope's prowess when it comes to development and all of that. But others then, on the other side, look at those things and say, but those things were products of an apartheid state.
Yeah.
They were fruits of a poisoned tree. So they are not in a position to heap praises on Kgosi Mangope on the basis that they see Bophuthatswana as having been an extension of apartheid. In other words, Bophuthatswana made apartheid look good. And they point at things like, for instance, whenever there were international visitors who came to observe what was happening in South Africa, having heard about apartheid, the powers that be in Pretoria used to send those people to Bophuthatswana to go and see what was happening there, so as to take back home a message that says, no, this whole brouhaha about apartheid
Yeah.
is neither here nor there. People are enjoying themselves there. They are having a good time. There's peace. There's development, their jobs, the economy is thriving, and all of that. So the legacy is divided like that. At any given time, you'll find people who say he was dead, and then others have a totally opposite, view about him.
True. Very, 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 very sad. Very greatly said so. Take a quick break, and definitely when we come back, we're gonna get into those biography-orientated questions I told you about. We'll be delving more, looking into the key issues that took place. You spoke about the 1952 issues and the 1940s and how he came to be chief. So after that quick break that we're gonna take, we'll be definitely delving into that. Don't go anywhere. Take a moment. We'll be back. 10 minutes after the hour 8 o'clock, and like I always say, if you just tuned into your radio station, just know that you're listening to TUT FM 96.2. We're amplifying voices, empowering lives. And once again, we're still having Oupa Segalwe on our conversation, who's the head of communication and stakeholder relations at the South African Weather Services. And tonight we are unpacking his book, Lucas Mangope, Alive. So, Re Oupa, while we're still there, before we come to those biography orientated questions I told you about, allow me to take this one to say, now writing the book is just half of the journey, right? And the other half is getting it into the hands of the readers. Publishing a biography, especially that deals with the contentious historical issues, can come with its own hurdles. Allow me to take this question and say, talk to us about the challenges that you faced into getting this book published, and how did you overcome them? Were there any pushbacks from certain communities or stakeholders?
Well, it was a bit challenging, and I suppose the story would be all too familiar for any other person who has published a book or attempted to do so. Um, I have approached up to seven mainstream publishers in the process of getting this book out there, and the first five were not interested for various reasons. You know, some of them look at it and they say, the story is about history. It refers to a time long gone. No one is interested to read this kind of thing. And so it's not going to be prudent for us to throw resources behind it and get it published. You know, so you just get the sense that they believe that it was going to be a commercial flop. But you don't give up. You keep pushing, knocking on doors, because we are endowed with a lot of publishing houses in South Africa. You know, if you go to any bookshop and you pull out books from the shelves, you look at who published them. We have quite a lot of publishers who are always looking for new material, new talent to put out there. But I suppose the lesson from this is that if you believe in your work, you believe in what you have produced, you know, you shouldn't give up at the first attempt. You know, when one door shuts in your face, go to the next door, and if that one too is closed to you, keep going. You can imagine if I had given up on my fifth attempt, this book would not have seen the light of day. It was only when I approached the sixth and the seventh publishers that I was offered publishing deals, and I had to turn down one of them and go with the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very important to not never give up, you know, in your quest to get yourself published. Sometimes it will, you know, put you down. You know, it will dent your confidence. I remember the first publisher to turn me down. I I just lost confidence. I was disillusioned with the project, such that I abandoned it for 2 years. And after 2 years, I don't know, I was looking for something in my computer. There was this file that I couldn't find, and then I came across the early drafts of my manuscript. I read through a couple of them, and I felt to myself, look, even if I say so myself, but this is not so bad. You know, I should keep going. And then that inspired me to get back to it. And then even when I approached others and they were not interested, I just kept on going until such time I got that call one day to say, in fact, it was an email to say, send us the rest of the manuscript, because usually what they do, they don't want you to send the whole manuscript at once.
Yeah.
They will say to you, send one chapter and a synopsis of the book, and give us an outline of the rest of the chapters. Some would say send 3 chapters, and it doesn't have to be the first, second, and third chapter. It could be
The
any
in-betweens.
chapter, you know, picked randomly. And you send, and then you wait to hear what they're going to say. So when they finally call or email you to say, we are interested. I can't even explain the feeling. It's just a very good feeling. You know, you
Yeah,
feel like
yeah, yeah.
the work that you have put in for so many hours, so many nights, so many days is finally paying off.
True, true. And now we're about to move into the biography orientated questions. Got a very, very good team that worked furiously so to make sure that everything is perfectly lined up. Now, the first question would come to say, Khosi Mangope's life as a leader, like, and you did mention that really began early in his life. If we look at his life in the 1940s, I guess he became the leader of the Mahlatwa region. And I believe he had just turned 21 at that time. But again, some might say it was not surprisingly that he would lead from such an early age, given that the fact he was born into a family of chiefs, one would say. Would you say that his leadership at the time was greatly influenced by his upbringing?
Definitely. I mean, if you look at, let's start with his schooling. I mentioned earlier that he went to school at St. Peter's Secondary School,
Yes, you did.
where he was schoolmates with the likes of Andrew Mlangeni, and they were students of O.R. Tambo, who taught them mathematics and science. Now, at that time, he was elected prefect by the school community, both the students and the staff. That
Mm-hmm.
means he was entrusted with the role of overseeing the conduct of fellow students in their hostels or in their residences, right? And that was quite a responsibility for a teenager. You know, he got introduced to his first leadership role at that time. And then when he completed his studies there in 1945, he went back home to Motswedi, and upon arrival there, his father sent him off to Botswana across the border to learn the mechanics of traditional leadership at the
Yeah.
feet of a very accomplished chief that side of the Bangwaketsi. His name was Kosiba Twain. So he spent time there learning what it means to be a Motswana man, learning what it means to be a chief or someone who was in the line of succession to become a chief. That is to say, it is true that his upbringing introduced him to leadership. In fact, when
Yeah.
he came back, his father was very frail and in his 80s, and he engaged him in what we call today job shadowing. So he started sharing his
Mm.
father's leadership role in the Bahurutsubo Manyane traditional leadership office. So he was exposed to that kind of thing. But his father was also very strict, and he always emphasized to him that, look, you need to conduct yourself in a particular way in order to be able to take over from me one day. An example is a story that happened in his youth. He used to be responsible for taking care of the livestock that his father owned.
Okay.
And the story goes that one day he went away to the bushes to look over or watch over the livestock. And then when he came back, he was very thirsty. And then he happened to pass through a field that belonged to a villager, and it was awash with ripe watermelons. And he stole one of those watermelons, helped himself to it because he was thirsty. When his father heard that, he was very cross with him, and he gave him a lesson of his life that you are one in line to be chief one day. You can never be caught dead stealing from one of your subjects. And that
Yes.
was a lesson that I suppose he thought he would keep uppermost in his mind as he grew into that leadership position that he eventually assumed.
And then with that, you did answer the question that I was going to ask you secondly to say that since well he was the leader of the Matrata region and then now coming into 1940s to lead ba Hurutse ba Bumunyane Bomanyane, right? A traditional community. It was given that he would become a chief should his father pass by, right? So, but you did answer that. Now, coming to this conversation, coming to this question to say, the 1950s and 60s were marked by anti-apartheid movements, and it was around that time when we saw the rise of the organizations such as the ANC. Take for instance its Defiance campaign of 1962, and the Communist Party of South Africa. And the government at that time was also intensifying its fight against the oppression, or say the opposition through the implementation of certain laws, such as the Suppression of Communist Act, Population Registration Act, and the Group Areas Act. Laws that some arguably say were aimed at enforcing segregation and suppressing the opposition. Now, talk to us about Kgosi Mangope's stance at the time, and perhaps tell us more about his relations with either the government at the time or the opposition.
Maybe I should start here and about his rise to the throne of the Bahorisbo Manyane. There's a bit of controversy there because his father had assumed that role as a regent, meaning he was holding the fort for somebody else who was supposed to take over, but was junior of age at the time. And unfortunately, his father held on to that role even when the person he was holding the fort for had become of ripe age to take over. And it's alleged that he had even banished or exiled the family of that person so that he minimizes any threats to the throne that he had occupied. And it has been such a big deal for the people in that area that when he passed away, instead of the throne returning to the rightful heir, it was passed down to his own son, being Kgosi Mangope, the one we are talking about, because his father too was called Lucas Manyane Mangope. So he named this one, who is the subject of this book, after himself. And then such that today in Motswedi, there's still that dispute, and it's one of those that are being investigated by the provincial government. And one of the reasons why Kgosi Mangope Senior, the father to this one, was kept in that role was on the basis of the fact that he was seen by the government of the day as a pliable Kgosi. In other words, he was more on the side of the government. You know, when the government demanded that he collect taxes from among his people to assist the government with revenue collection, he complied. When the government implemented the pass laws, he was seen as those who complied with that. And this is why in 1958, when there was a rebellion against pass laws, his home was attacked because of that. And people turned against him, saying he is an extension of the, oppressive government of the time. And he passed away later that year, 1958, the Kgosi Mangope Senior. And then that paved the way for his son, Kgosi Mangope, the subject of the book, to take over. Even at that time, before taking over, there was a bit of a controversy in that there were attempts to get the rightful heir to take over the role, but that was unsuccessful because the rightful heir, a gentleman called Rakaje Mangope, who lived in Dobsonville and worked in the mines there, was seen to be, close to the ANC. And as a result, he fell out of favor with the government of the day, and that paved the way for Kgosi Mangope to assume that particular throne. And on the occasion of his coronation, he assured or reassured the government of the day that in him they had their man, and that's how he stayed. He stayed in that role. And now this is now 1959 August when he was installed in that position, or when he took the throne. Now 1959, as I said earlier, was the time when the government was now beginning to fully implement these segregationist policies, starting with the Bantu Authorities Act and a range of other legislation that followed there, that established tribal authorities. In fact, it was a three-tier system. So at the base, you had tribal authorities, which operated more like municipalities, local municipalities. And then after tribal authorities, you had several tribal authorities making up what was called a regional authority, which we would say it's something like a district municipality. I'm comparing it to that system, but it wasn't exactly like that because it was made up of chiefs as opposed to people who are elected into office on the strength of a popular vote, right? And then after regional authorities, several regional authorities made up territorial authorities. Now, in that part of the country, you had the Tswana Territorial Authority.
Yeah.
And Kgosi Mangope rose through the ranks, firstly as the leader of the Bahuruts Bomanyane Tribal Authority and making it to the Zirast Regional Authority and eventually getting to participate at the Tswana Territorial Authority as the deputy to the Kgosi that was in charge of that territorial authority. That would have been Kgosi Tidimani Pilani of Bakatlaba Bahakafela in Moruleng outside Sun City. So, and you see in later years that system transforming into something called self-governance when that territorial authority is given some sort of autonomy to run its own affairs. And that's when you start seeing the system changing to become something similar to what we have. You have government departments, your Department of Public Works there, Department of Education there, and so forth. And then these very people who were playing a role in this kind of system eventually called for independence because they were dissatisfied with the system of self-governance. They felt that it was still under the control of the white ruling elites in Pretoria, and they wanted to run their own affairs, which is then later in the 70s, you see, Buputatswana following in the footsteps of Transkei, having accepted the offer of independence from Pretoria and the formation of political parties. There were two political parties that came out of that system when there were differences of opinions between those who were playing a role in the self-governing state. The one party was called Oupa Segalwe, led by Ndate Pilani, Kgosi Pilani, and then you had Buputatswana National Party, which was led by Kgosi Mangope, and then of course the Buputatswana National Party would go on to win the election and lead that territory to the so-called independence. But of course, a few months or so after that victory, that party, was torn apart by internal strife, leadership battles within that party, such that Kgosi Mangope ended up breaking away to lead a splinter group that established the Buputatswana Democratic Party, which would go on to govern that homeland for good.
I understand all of that. Now let's go back and look at the establishment of the Tswana Territorial Authority in 1961, right? You said it formed part of the government's efforts to create separate homelands or Bantustans. I'm very interested in his rapid advancement from a minor chief to a vice chairman of the Tswana Territorial Authority, especially shortly after the uprising in the Huritse Reserve against the extension of passes to women between 1957 and 1959. What could that rapid advancement be attributed to?
Yeah, I suppose it's what I've just mentioned, that he was seen as one who is more in support of the government of the day, just like his father. As I said, on the occasion of his coronation, he did, reassure the government of the day that they could rely on him. There was a minister of a department called Native Affairs that was in attendance in Motswedi on that occasion. And that minister was one of the main speakers on the day of his coronation. And he, in acceptance or in his acceptance speech, he assured the government that in him they had an ally. And I suppose then going from there, it was clear where he stood, because all the others were very opposed to the system. Most of them anyway, not all of them. They were opposed to the system of the time, and he was seen as one who could, help the government to get its way. So it wasn't surprising that he rose through the ranks as rapidly as you saw it, and going even beyond the TTA or the Tswana Territorial
Yeah.
Authority days, such that he was one that was seen as the most suitable to lead that particular territory to a quasi-independence.
And then I have to understand that Mangope's presidency was not smooth sailing. It was marred by allegations of corruption and human rights abuses that would later be investigated by a commission of inquiry chaired by Advocate Mbisile Sikwinya. During your research, what did you find were the basis of these allegations?
So the Square Commission of Inquiry came after 1994. And it looked at allegations of wrongdoing by Kgosi Mangope, working with a few of the civil servants and political appointees that worked under him. And there was quite a range of things, that were investigated by that particular commission. But all of them suggested that he used his authority to dip into state coffers for his own benefit, some sort of undue enrichment. And it wasn't just the government coffers that he was alleged to have dipped into. He was also alleged to have helped himself to the resources, the collective resources of the Bahuru Tsibomanyane in Motswedi. Let's start with the government resources first. He worked with certain officials and certain former ministers of Bophuthatswana to access the intelligence / fund of that particular administration using two fake companies to pose as though they were trading with the state or something along those lines. But those companies did not exist. That money, the setting up of those fake companies was just to hide the activities or rather hide what the money was going to be used for. And when you use intelligence funds, they don't always account, because they say no, you will expose state secrets. So it was that kind of thing, and that those monies were used to refurbish a lot of his properties all over that place that is now the Northwest, including his house in Motswedi and on all of that. His businesses, the farms that he owned, which farms he bought from his own government for next to nothing compared to what anybody else could have paid for those kind of properties. Those were the findings of the Square Commission of Inquiry. But with regard to the Bahuru Tsibomanyane in Motswedi, they collectively own a piece of land. It was a farm initially. It's now called Masibudule.
Okay.
Some years ago, after they acquired that piece of land, it was discovered that there were huge deposits of chrome buried deep in the bowels of that particular piece of land, and that spawned the establishment of a mining company, or rather, that spawned the mining activities that still exist to this day on that particular piece of land. And as the commission found, the royalties that were accruing from those mining activities were supposed to have been deposited into an account that was owned by the Bahuru Tsibomanyane collectively for the community's development and so forth. But the commission found that those royalties were going into a bank account into which only Kgosi Mangope, or a bank account which only Kgosi Mangope had access to, right? So all those benefits were going to him according to the commission findings. And that's what people refer to when they say his government was corrupt. And on the strength of the findings of the commission, the government of Dr. Popo Molefe pressed theft and fraud charges against Kgosi Mangope, and he was tried in the Northwest Division of the High Court. and then was eventually convicted in 1998, and he was sentenced to concurrent jail terms not exceeding 2 years. But there was also an option of a fine, so he opted to pay a fine of just over 2 million rand, and that's how he was able to stay out of jail. So when people say he was corrupt and all of that, they refer to those kind of things.
Reports, yeah.
Yes, but then there's another question of human rights abuses and all of that.
Please, Please, Mr.
Yes.
Oupa, I was saying that before you come into those reports, I want to get to those immediately after we take a quick break so that we can try and get questions from our listeners. Please do stay on the line. We take a quick break and we'll be back. Definitely 15 minutes before the hour, 9 o'clock. And like I always say, if you just tuned into your radio station, just know that you're listening to TUT FM 96.2. We're amplifying voices and empowering lives. Not even end. There's no end to that word, empowering lives. Mr. Oupa, welcome once again. And before that, you were saying, are you hearing double sounds?
No, I can hear you loud and clear.
All right, definitely. Thank you. I was saying before we took that break to say, talk to us about the reports of torture, harassment, and arbitrary dismissals of dissidents during Mangope's rule, and perhaps tell us how these human rights abuses significantly tarnished his legacy and contribute to the growing opposition against his name.
So, Jose Mangope was totally opposed to the ANC and its allied organizations like the SACP, and other formations that were anti-apartheid, like your PAC and all of that. And some of them were banned actually during apartheid. They were only unbanned early in the 90s, in the early 90s. And even the organizations that operated underground, like your UDF and all of that, he was opposed to all of this. So whenever he got a whiff of activity, political activity that threatened to dislodge him, he took it personally, and he was very ruthless. I'll make an example of the coup that occurred in 1988 in Setswana, where he was deposed for 15 hours or so before Pretoria restored him to power. Those who were responsible for that coup really felt his wrath. There's a gentleman that I traveled to the US to interview. His name is Timothy Piri. He was a soldier in Setswana, and he planned and executed that coup, working closely with the late Rocky Malewana Metsing, who I also got the opportunity to speak to during the research of this book. And those people were tortured. They were held at Kupe. Kupe was the headquarters of Setswana intelligence. They were holding cells there. They were tortured. They were beaten up. They were totally harassed as part of the law enforcement's attempt to get to the bottom of what happened. But those are just a few of the people. Many other people felt the wrath of Setswana. I mean, I think you broadcast to people in Winterfeld. If there are people listening from Winterfeld, they will recall that there were people that were killed following the mass gathering that took place at Odi Stadium, which was also in condemnation of the Setswana regime. So there's quite a lot of people who died, who were tortured, and all of that. There's another story that comes to mind is of a young man in Mangope's backyard who died in the custody of police officers, merely because he was suspected. The issue was that he was wearing a T-shirt that either had ANC colors or had the face of Nelson Mandela emblazoned across the chest. So you just have to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report to see the stories of all of those people who died during that regime. But all in all, Mangope's government was opposed to dissent. And he was heavy-handed in terms of dealing with dissent, and that's what people refer to when they say there were gross human rights violations there. I'm not even going to talk about what happened on the eve of the collapse of his government when the right wingers entered Mahikeng and shot at people randomly, killing a whole lot of them and maiming others. Yeah.
Right. Let's take a couple of questions from some of our listeners here. Let me bring this so that I can see properly to the light. We have Austin Sima from Soshanguve Block H who's saying, what is one lesson that you learned from Mr. Lucas Mangope?
Well, there are a few lessons that I learned from his story, and one of which is that, the more things change, the more they stay the same. If you read the book, you will find a chapter that deals with a gentleman who came from Israel, originally from the USSR of the time, the Soviet Union of the time. His name was Shabtai Kamanovich. If you look at what he did in Bophuthatswana in concert with Khosi Mangope and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
you would immediately think of the Gupta story. So if we had known, if the book like this had come much earlier, we would have probably known about which pitfalls to avoid as a country, because his
Yes.
story mirrors exactly that of the Guptas. But when you also look at I mean, there are many similarities. Earlier, I spoke about what the Commission of Inquiry into Square found in respect of the refurbishment that were done to his house in Motswedi and all of that using state coffers. And they were saying they had to do that because he often worked from home, and he hosted people at his home as part of his work and all of that. And when I read that, I immediately started thinking of the Nkandla story. And you then look at how the UCDP collapsed, because this is a party that was official opposition in the Northwest for two successive terms. Today is nowhere to be found. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
even participate in the most recent election,
Elections, yes.
and so forth. And when you look at how things started going wrong for the party, it was a cult politics, in that most of the people who were members of that party and supporters of that party were only there because of him. The moment he was expelled from the party, its support started waning. And there was no internal democracy within the party, although it had a system in terms of which it went to Congress every 5 years to elect new leadership. Whenever they got to Congress, his most fervent supporters within the party would just rise from the floor and say, yo, I'm very pleased with Khosi Mangope's leadership. I don't think we should proceed with elections. He can stay there. And he wouldn't even stop those people. He would just allow them to keep carrying him on and on like that. And that caused a lot of resentment among those who wanted to challenge him for the leadership position. And in the long run, that caused, that contestation, and led to the implosion of the party. So those are some of the lessons that we can pick up from them, to say, if we have political parties that do not place internal democracy above everything else, they are likely to go that route. And if there are political parties that exist because of the leader as opposed to what the party stands for, they are likely to run into that kind of trouble. So there are plenty lessons that we can draw from his story.
Plenty of lessons indeed. Tsepo Maliti from Soshanguve blog HH says, what is the key difference between this specific book and other books, and why should one read it?
Well, for starters, there is not a single book that tells the story of Lucas Mangope other than this one. This was the first book that focuses on him. Of course, you find other books where his story gets told in passing as part of a bigger story, but this one is the first account of his life, from the womb to the tomb. And I'm hoping that it will spark interest such that other people can pick up their pens and write from a different angle about his story, because I don't think figures like him are one-dimensional. I may have written from a particular angle, but somebody else can explore a different angle and still tell his story. So I would say this is one story that, if you are into history, into South Africa's political history, into the story of our transition from apartheid to the current dispensation, this is probably one book you want to read. There's a lot of political drama in it. There's a lot of backstabbings. There's a lot of heartbreaks. There's a lot of violence, graphic violence. Hosi Mangope had 3 of his sisters dying, killed by their children and their nephews. And he had 2 of his children dying under very violent circumstances, one of them getting stabbed at the beer hall in his backyard in Mutsuri. So there's quite a lot in here, but there's a bit of romance as well. There's this and that. So if you are into that kind of thing, this one is definitely for you.
All right, moving on, says Chris Lawrence to say, now this one comes to ask to say, how did you get your position as the head of communication at the South African Weather Services?
Well, I applied. They advertise positions, and if you think you fit the bill, you throw your name in the hat, and if you're lucky, you get called for an interview. And if you do get that, opportunity to sit before a panel and state your case, you do your best to prepare, and sometimes you are fortunate. So I was fortunate, I suppose, in that regard. But I had been in that kind of space for a while, because I was the spokesperson for the public protector for the longest time. I was the senior manager of communication in that office, and even before then, I had worked in the space, so I fitted the bill, and I was successful in my application. Don't know
And
what else to say.
And while we are still here, allow me to ask this to say, what opportunities are there for students, right, in terms of internships, and also students that may are studying journalism or communications? What opportunities are there at the moment?
You would have noticed that a lot of newspapers or media organizations have been retrenching people, because newspapers are dying, or perhaps are struggling to compete with new media in the form of social media and online publications. And so there has been a job bloodbath in that area. But I find that in the public relations, corporate communications, marketing space, there's still a few opportunities that can be explored, and people must not be disillusioned. They must continue to believe and work hard, and they will get those opportunities. But I work for the Weather Service now, as I said, and it would be remiss of me not to mention this. And this is not specific to people who study journalism and all of that.
Yes.
The Weather Service is a meteorological organization, and I think I have people that I work with who say they studied at the Technical Pretoria of old, which is part of TUT now. And so it offers meteorology, and that is an industry or a sector where us as Black people are underrepresented. So I would encourage people to look in that direction as well, because the South African Weather Service specializes in meteorology. You find all the forecasters, the weather forecasters, the climatologists, and so forth, are people who studied meteorology. So if you are interested in predicting weather, there's quite a lot of opportunities there, be they internships or even full-time opportunities to explore that kind of work. And the South African Weather Service is considered a big organization in that space, such that every now and then we have a lot of our forecasters being poached by our counterparts from across the seas in New Zealand, in Dubai, and in Europe. So if people are interested in that kind of thing, please go to the Weather Service website and learn more about what we do. And maybe you might just turn out to be one of our forecasters in the future.
All right. And then Mpoma Silo says, let's talk about Babelegi in Hammanskraal, or the stadium in Mabopane, Mabatu Stadium in Mafikeng. Now, since the democratic South Africa, those places have become dilapidated. So dilapidated. And the only place that one would say survived in Garankuwa zone is in the Garankuwa zone 15 factories. Would you say there was a sabotage to Setswana?
Well, a lot of people think that could have been the case, but I just put it down to lack of maintenance in respect of the stadiums, the two stadiums. And it's not just those stadiums, to be fair. I mean, if you go to Mamelodi, HMPJ is more or less in that category. But it is true that there is a sentiment that people feel that there has been neglect on the part of the current government to maintain the infrastructure that they inherited from Setswana. And others, it may be just a question of a different approach that the government that took over did not believe in the kind of approach that Setswana followed in terms of economic development, which is why the Babelehi, factories and those that you found in Mohwase don't exist anymore, and the buildings that they used to operate from are more like white elephants now, just like the two stadiums are. So it's just one of those. People feel that perhaps they should have been utilized. There are those that are utilized. Where I come from in Zerast, we had infrastructure that was built during Setswana days. It's now owned by the Northwest Development Corporation, and they're still in use, like the shopping complex that we use in Belvedere, and many other pieces of infrastructure, like the housing corporation owned flats in Mahikeng and all of that. They were still under use, but although they have since been sold. So it's one of those things.
All right. Last question from me. Then I let you go, sir. What lessons from Mr. Mangope's life do you think are most relevant for current and future generations of South Africa?
I suspect I've already answered that question when I was making reference to stories that's similar to what is called state capture today, stories that are similar to Nkandlas of this world and what happened to the UCDP. I think those lessons are relevant today because you still see those kind of things happening. Hence, I said it seems the more things change, the more they stay the same. But I wouldn't want to spoil it for people. I would advise people to get their hands on a copy of this book and read it for themselves to see for themselves the things that I'm talking about.
And while we are still there, do you have any future projects in the pipeline, either related to Mr. Mangope or any other historical features?
At the moment, I'm, spending more time promoting the book, ensuring that it circulates well, it reaches all corners of the country. When I'm done with that, I will then look at what else I can do. I do have a few ideas about what I want to write about, but it's too early to tell at this point in time. I haven't even typed the first word. It's still in development in my head.
No, well, I have to thank you for taking time to share your insights about your book and the journey it took into bringing this important work to the public. It is clear that Mr. Mangope's story remains a very vital part of South African history. And Mr. Oupa, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us.
It was a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
The Groundbreakers, Mondays to Thursdays, 7 to 9 p.m. on TUT FM.